God, give me the grace to accept with serenity, the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever and the next. Amen. Why? And so we pick up this week with chapter 6, which she titled The AIDS Pandemic. And in any order of how you would like to attend to these questions, what are your thoughts? What are your reflections?
On AIDS pandemic, the first one, one fact introduced, I thought was striking was the impact of AIDS and how severe it was. I know from watching different things in the LGBTQ community that it was awful. It was a horrible, horrible disease. But that was kind of what I thought he alluded to. And how should we, because I'm going to say that we are red letter Christians, are trying to be, how did we engage this issue? And I think he pointed largely at compassion and understanding. And that's kind of what I took from chapter 6.
I wonder how relevant a question this is now, because we have a gay relative who takes a pill every day and that prevents him from getting AIDS. And we have a friend who is heterosexual. He's not gay, I think I used the right word. And he has had active AIDS for 25 years now, but he has medications that kept him alive and healthy and enjoying life in the meantime.
Yeah, certainly the advancement in medical science and the research therein has enabled us to live in a time period when HIV isn't an immediate, while chronic, it isn't the death sentence that it was in the 80s and even into the 90s. That the advancement of medical sciences and pharmaceuticals are able to grant life for persons living with HIV. And yet at the same time, the one thing that I feel, I remember traveling to South Africa and just this massive campaign of education, of trying to help people understand the citizens therein to understand the realities of HIV/AIDS and the disinformation campaigns that were even lodged by the political leaders of the day, to such a degree that similar, not the same, but similar to what he was saying about some evangelical pastors saying that HIV/AIDS is a sign of God's condemnation for sin. There was disinformation in South Africa, even while we were watching, even as we were walking those streets of, well, if you get HIV, you can just simply take a shower and wash it off. Or, there was certainly probably what we in the West would call voodoo or witch doctors, tribal medicines, magic, healers that you could go in as like pharmacies, and you could buy snake oil, so to speak, for the curing of HIV. And I think that the realities of that kind of different disinformation, even when we are living in a world that has the pharmaceutical advancements, that still weighs a heavy impact. I mean, we still have many in our world who would claim that, Julie used the word curse, that that we have persons who contract HIV, are they do so because of a curse or because of God smiting them. And we, at the same time, while we do have the pharmaceutical advancements that help to give life, and it not being a death sentence, they're also incredibly expensive, and they're more accessible in developing countries than they are in non-developing countries. And so you end up, as we walk through a township there in South Africa of 100,000 people living on top of each other. It was an HIV/AIDS colony of persons living in this sequestered area. And it was, again, a total challenge for medical truths and to receive the proper care that they need. Julie?
One of the points that he made, and this is in line with what you just said, is that it is incumbent upon us. We have done a lot in the United States, but it is incumbent upon us to help the rest of the world, and we have, but there is more to be done. And I thought that was an excellent point. One other point is that I think is relevant to our times, is that a third of our community, which he refers to as your evangelical right, still perpetuates a large portion of these ideas that it is a curse associated with homosexuality. Because they continue to do this, organizations like QAnon and things like that are still trying to use that. A third point that he asserted was, and I think it's also relevant today, is the fact that the political machines still use this hot button issue to whip up the population, the voters, to get them to the polls, and it has proved repeatedly that it can do that. But in summary, what all of this does is perpetuates these ideas, which for the most part have gone underground and are still very much traded in, up to, I think he said, 2/3 of the population not being real comfortable with gay people.
Thank you. Yeah, Rita?
Kind of surprised in reading that really more of it is headed towards the promiscuity than it is from any kind of gay sexual intercourse. And I guess I hadn't given that a lot of thought, that it was carried home to people more so than it was a one-to-one kind of situation.
Yeah. Yeah. I yes. I think that's certainly insightful. And I think as a Christian, not necessarily as a pastor, but as a Christian, I think that, it's important to be aware of the idea of heterosexual married persons and their picadillos, their infidelities, and the impact that has, that a decision of making, of having a relationship outside of marriage, how it might have that larger impact, the potential for that, the larger impact upon families, and how we strive towards healing in response to that as well. Any other thoughts on this before we move to the next chapter? Yeah, Nancy.
Yeah, one quick thought, going on what Rita said too, the thing that impressed me or made an impact was again what was brought up about people bringing it home to their families, and so many women and then would pass it on. If they were pregnant, it would get passed on to their children, and they were like the victims in that they had no control about it. And then talk about people wanting to have condoms so it wouldn't spread that way to other people. And I think there was one thing in there that an evangelical is, oh no, we don't do that. And the example of a 17-year-old girl's sole support of her brother and sister, and the only way she could support them was going out and basically selling herself. And this was in Africa or something, and they said, you know, don't you think that she should at least have a condom to protect herself? And the evangelical is absolutely no way. And they said, the CEO of the agency, well, what would you do for her? And the only answer was, I wouldn't give her a condom. And it's like, that just shocked me. You know, it's like, here's something that can be done. And some of the evangelicals are, oh no, because I guess you're supposed to starve or die or something like that.
Yeah.
Because you don't have food, you know. It's like the disconnect is just amazing.
Yeah. I included, for some of you who've been around for a while, long before the pandemic, I printed a bulletin that included the picture of a young woman I met in South Africa, who Campolo describes my experience with her. She was a young adult woman. Her whole family had died of AIDS. She herself had AIDS, and she was raising not only her child, her infant child, but also her younger siblings as well. And I included that picture in a bulletin several years ago, and I don't have it accessible right now, but so in reading that from him, I was reminded of just exactly the very thing that he's written about was exactly the very thing that I had encountered. I remember the first time that I knowingly met someone with AIDS, and I was a hospital chaplain in Louisville, and I'd been doing rounds and had gone into a room with a man with AIDS, and I didn't know that, and it was the first time I'd ever met someone that I know of with that situation, and I caught myself feeling very awkward, and when I debriefed it with my then supervisor, he asked me if I had held his hand as I prayed for him. And I had said no. And then he said, well, do you normally hold hands with people you pray for? And I said, yes. And he said, well, why didn't you? And I said, honestly, I just didn't. This was new. And I think my inner prejudices had come forward and my anxieties. And he said, for persons who are living with HIV/AIDS, the power of touch means more than anyone in the world with any other ailment, because they do have this very thing with which I was wrestling, which is a stigma of what we would see in scripture as leprosy, right? The don't touch, the impure. And that was a real soul-searching growth moment for me. And then not too long after that, I had a classmate who had just found out that he was HIV positive, and I've visited with him. I've kept up with him only in the last little while to see that he's still a pastor. He's thriving. He's healthy, and has a successful ministry. And just remember the power of him telling me that, and then holding his hands as we prayed, and the impact that it made for him. And that's not about me as much as it is about a lesson learned of how society, how we can be prejudice and our stigmas of those who are facing things that we are not can cause those who are struggling with them to be even more alienated and stigmatized. And that happens especially within the life of the church, for which red letter Christians should pay attention. Kitty?
I was just going to add, similar to what you were talking about. When I worked in the hospital, we gave breathing treatments to AIDS patients. And I had coworkers who refused to go into the rooms. So I would go in and give the breathing treatment. I wouldn't put on gloves. And I talked with my patient and touched him. And he said, "Thank you so much." He said, "Everybody that comes in here looks like some space alien. They've got mask and headgear and robes and stuff and gloves." And he really appreciated it. And I think part of that is education. I knew about AIDS and how it was transmitted, and I wasn't going to get it from touching him with my bare hands. And I think education all around has been lax.
Thank you for sharing. Well, all right, let's move into the next one here. He has this section called the hot button issues, and I have parceled them out so that you know, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, small bites at that. So let's take a look at this first chapter, chapter 7, and he speaks about gay rights, and our same 3 questions. Let's use them as ways for us to be invited into discussing and debriefing what we read here in chapter 7.
It's still politicized. We're reading from a book that's 13, 14 years old, and it was very political and high button topic then, and it still is today, maybe in slightly different ways, but within the who goes to what bathroom in elementary schools, because it's such a problem that isn't a problem, and who will be on a sports team. I mean, it's still so much out there with certain political parties as, you know, hot button things to get people to vote. So I don't know how it's ever going to really be resolved.
Yeah.
And not talked about politically.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm not naive, and I certainly I have a profound understanding of the sin of humanity. I don't think I quite fully realized the mechanisms of what are some of these things that we can get on the ballot that will drive my base out, and then therefore also vote for the candidate that I'm trying to. And so then the idea of something like gay rights or marriage ended up being something that would be elevated in order to achieve a particular candidate election or this, that, and the other. I don't think that I had fully understood the mechanisms of that network.
Question for you.
Sure.
Do you feel like the marriage ceremony is a political action of the state when you finish it?
I am so glad that you asked that.
Sorry about that, but that was a major part of his writing here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was ordained 2009. I came here in 2013. I probably did near 15 to 17 weddings in 4 years in Virginia. And I had a lot of opportunity to think about that. And my story is multi-layered. When I came out of seminary and was ordained, the Presbyterian Church USA did not sanction same-sex marriages and would not therefore permit or give permission for pastors to officiate such weddings. And then therefore that whatever my theological standing or position was, didn't matter because the rules are the rules. And then it became, I started doing all these weddings, and then it became evident that that was going to change, that was going to be discussed and very likely change in my tenure as a pastor. And the first thing was with regard to the ordination of persons in the LGBT community. And so I realized then that I needed to start giving a whole lot more focus and attention to not only to gay rights, gay marriage, etc., but also to my role as a clergy. And let's see, would have been in my third year there when I was approached by persons wanting me to officiate their wedding. I began telling them that I will officiate a wedding, but if you want, but I do not sign wedding license. So they would need to get married by the justice of the peace, and that justice of the peace would sign the wedding license, and we would still do the wedding, still do the big shebang. But my role is an agent of the church and not an agent of the state. And so I wanted to abdicate my state-sponsored responsibility as an agent of the state. I am not an agent of the state. I don't want to be an agent of the state. And so that lasted for a year, and then it became too complicated to explain to folks. And I figured I had better opportunity to explore that in other ways. But my personal opinion, Rita, in response to your question, is I would love nothing more than to not have the responsibility of being an agent of the state. I do sign the wedding license. It's just administrative. I realized in reading this that I have never, not once, ever said, on behalf of the power invested in me by the state of Texas, I've never said that, or state of Virginia. I've actually realized that in reading this chapter. I've never, ever said that. And so I am a agent of the Church of Jesus Christ. If the state happens to give me, and honestly, I realized this, I realized one more thing. If I'm going to be an agent of the state, I want to be a full agent. After the death of Jean Johnson, one of our beloved sisters who died a few years ago, when someone dies in their home is when I learned here in Austin, when someone dies in their home, before the body can be moved, a police officer, the justice of the peace, has to come, or the coroner has to come and declare that, yes, this person really is deceased. And until that time, when the person comes, a police officer has to sit and wait. And that was probably 4 to 6 hours after she died, and a police officer sat there at the house waiting for someone to come certify. If we're going to be agents of the states, I don't know why clergy wouldn't be empowered to be those agents as well. I was there. And otherwise, we just need to get out of the business. And
I had never considered it. I mean, it just kind of floored me to see that in print, that he felt like he was serving as an agent of the state in those circumstances. And it never occurred to me.
Yeah, well, and that also, and then after I moved here to Austin, well, the other part, let me say one other thing. The summer of 2013, I have a cousin who was getting married to her longtime girlfriend, and the denomination still had not sanctioned same-sex marriage or given permission to clergy to officiate that. And my cousin knew that she was never going to ask me because she knew that I would probably say yes, which would jeopardize my vocation. So she and her now bride flew to Washington, D.C., and Wendy, Phoenix, and I drove up. They had to rent a pastor in D.C. because it was legal there. And they got married, and it was just us. And I included that story in a sermon 7 years ago, 5 years ago, however many long ago. Within a year of coming to Austin is when that changed for the denomination. And I think that is when, Rita, to answer your question, that is really when it became clear to me that, you know, if I am to be an agent of the Church of Jesus Christ, then I need to be all in. My role as clergy is to offer a blessing upon this worship service, and that this is something that I, as a clergy, feel that God has ordained. And that is regardless of sexuality, period. I did one wedding where I knew I should not have done it, but I did it anyway. And then they divorced 6 weeks later. And so I make it very clear when people engage me that my role is to stand up on behalf of Jesus Christ and offer a blessing. And by doing so, I'm acknowledging that God sanctions this. And I don't need the state to tell me who I can and cannot speak on behalf of God. Does that make sense? So that's a long story, but you asked, you opened a can.
Yeah, I wanted to know.
You opened a can. What other thoughts? We're John, Hillary, we're on chapter 7 relating to gay rights. And I had sent that agenda out late last night. I don't know if y'all got a copy of that.
Josh, and everybody, we're down here. We had gone, when we're down in San Antonio, we go to Covenant Presbyterian Church with Dan Milford as pastor, and they go from 10:30 to 11:30. Today was their mission Sunday, so they went a little bit long, and so we're in their version of fellowship hall down in.
Wow, stepping out on me, huh?
It's a good day to do it.
On your recommendation.
Yeah, well, okay. Yeah, what's somebody, let's hear from someone else. Thank you for asking. Julie?
One of the interesting parts of this was he talked about the rights that the LGBTQ community has or not has. And he gave a lot of great statistics showing what states were impacting this and declining to allow all rights to the LGBTQ community. And I use that in terms of gay because nowadays, one of the things that our culture does is they push everybody that is, I'll say, different into that group. And so the key point that he made is that varies. And when you look at the state of Texas, we are among 3 that continue to make very deep attempts to keep the LGBTQ community under control and retard their rights, and everything has to be challenged individually and at certain times, and sometimes it can be stopped and sometimes it can't. And for example, the recent situation where they barred trans girls in sports. Now that's kind of a really hot button issue, but it with one domino, others fall. And so with that, I yield the podium.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think you're right. I mean, when I had asked my cousin who had been engaged for this long relationship with her now bride, now spouse, you know, why hadn't you done this? And she said, well, you know, and Rita, this kind of attends to back to your question. She said, kind of, what does it matter? I mean, for one, they're Baptist, and their Baptist church would never recognize them. The state would never recognize them. She would never have the opportunity to be with her spouse in the emergency room or beneficiary rights. And so when that changed that summer of 2013, that was like, oh, this is a real game changer. This, now we can have some real benefits, even as restricted and limited as they may be. This is why they decided to go ahead and go forward with getting married. So yeah, I think, you know, and Julie, what you're, you know, and I appreciated that. I felt like Compono had some humility in here and recognizing that he had some areas of growth. And I admit, I myself have still, I've got a long way to go on matters related to the LGBTQIA plus community. And I've had several conversations over the last several months of trying to better understand, as you mentioned, Julie, with regard to the trans community in athletics. And that's something with which I'm seeking more information myself. And I think that is kind of his point, which is, you know, red letter Christians would not necessarily be dismissive of this outright, but leaning forward, letting, as we said earlier, turning to wonder, what does my reaction teach me? You know, what am I feeling right now? Welcoming discomfort and dislocation in an awareness that God is holding us, and we can trust in God who is holding us as we are taking on issues that may not be our native language. Anyone else want to speak on this topic? John.
I don't know if you already talked about it, Josh, but the example that Campolo used about gay marriage and, you know, the state part of that, and then the before the eyes of God part of that. And he talked about the Netherlands. And when I read it, I didn't see the name of what that program was called, or that practice was called, where you get married by contract in the Netherlands, and then you can, you know, it's primarily a contract between two people, and then you can go to a church and have it blessed or not. But that, the name for that in the Netherlands is called samenwoning, and it's literally a mashup of samen, S-A-M-E-N, which means together, and woning, W-O-N-I-N-G, which means living. So it literally means living together. And well, I lived in the Netherlands for a number of, about a year and a handful of months, but then was in Belgium, and so went back and forth to the Netherlands with friends that I had there. And that is a government program, and it's, I don't know if he characterized it right or not, but his example was just, but the people, most of the people in the Netherlands use that primarily to gain the government benefits that we would recognize as being gained by being married in a church wedding kind of thing. And so they can't sign leases, co-sign leases on apartments together unless you are samenwoning. You know, you can't, the hospital visitations and things like that. But it has morphed into a kind of a thing where it's made it more casual for people to enter into a samenwoning contract, and they view it as a way of, you know, just having sort of a long-term dating thing instead of the actual living together, you know, to get the benefits and the human rights acknowledged that we have in the States, where, you know, LGBTQIA plus, you know, gay rights, gay marriage folks that can't have those basic human rights, or, you know, enter into an insurance, life insurance or things like that. And so the Dutch people would do these contracts, and then it's very easy to break a Salmon voting contract. You just go back down to the clerk's office and say, we are no longer doing this, and you dissolve everything. But nobody tells you how to dissolve it, on the other hand. So just a little bit more information on that. It's morphed a little bit. When I lived in the Netherlands in 2001, 2002, and it was over there until about 2006. So,
I was thinking, and Rita had mentioned something about that prior to y'all coming on, which is what I was responding to when y'all came on. Civil unions is the term that the United States has moved towards, and I think that might have been how he was trying to categorize or characterize the idea with the Netherlands. And Rita, if you remember, part of what he was saying out of that was that politicians, many, especially conservative politicians, were talking about the sacred institution of marriage and using those words. And we've heard that. I mean, if you've heard political discourse, you hear that language, sacred discourse of the institution of marriage. And that was his point, which was, oh, you're on mute, Rita. That was his point, was if it's sacred, let it be sacred and keep it in the church. And let's not muddy the waters or confuse the lines by confusing church and state. Rita?
Josh, I heard those words in my church growing up. I mean,
Yeah.
that wasn't something that was new to politicians to say, to do a cover up. That's
Oh, sure,
been
right.
ingrained in my being for a long time.
Of course. Oh, yeah, of course. I think absolutely. And it's actually what I myself would say even to this day, because it is right. I think his point was, keeping the sacred in the church. If it's sacred, holy, and religious, then keeping it where it is and not in the government. There is a time and a place when, and I don't know how to do it, but at some point I would love to take a deep dive in our community about the First Amendment and free speech, free press, and the separation of church and state. I would love to take a deep dive into the realities of what that is and what that means. And maybe we'll cover that some time from a faith-based perspective, because I think it is something, the First Amendment especially, is something that has reality and has myth, and the myth sometimes gets elevated as legal reality when the myth is not legal reality. Does that make sense? And that's what I'd love to explore sometime.
Josh, you do that with the First Amendment. I'll take a nap until you get to the Second Amendment.
What a segue. Chapter 8 is gun control. What a segue, John. You set yourself up, brother. I will tell you, I want to offer something out of the gate. Again, we all know this is a book that's dated in time. And we've known that from the get. We've talked about that from the get. And so part of what I've tried to do is look for the main point that Campolo is trying to elevate, and about how red letter Christians should engage these issues. And this chapter, probably more than, who'd I lose? I lost the Nakamura's. This chapter, more than the ones we've read previously, has haunted me, was more haunting to me because of all that we know that has taken place with gun violence since this book was published, and the rabid amount of gun sales and the culture of guns that has been elevated, even more so than when the book was published. has been it was haunting to me as I read this chapter. And his first words, where was it? Well, I wasn't here. He talked about Americans have an addiction to guns. I can't remember where he wrote that. Final statement. We're huge Lego people in our house. We play with a lot of Lego. But Wendy and I have chosen that we don't have any toy guns of any sort for Phoenix from the time he's been born. So we don't have water guns. We don't have toy guns. We haven't done any of that for the whole of Phoenix's life. And whenever we get a Lego set like Star Wars, I take the guns out and I put them in a Ziploc bag. And I meant to bring it today, but I've got a Ziploc bag of guns and weaponry from Lego. And then I look at that every time as I add more guns to it. And I think, wow, man, wow. You know, how does this inadvertently elevate a gun culture to our children, who, on the one hand, we're hoping that these toys, the Lego, would help build creativity and engineering and three-dimensional processing. And on the other hand, inadvertently, including these weaponry. So that's all I wanted to add or say on this. What about yourselves? What thoughts do you have on this matter?
So for me, Josh, and this I think was maybe the first chapter where I started to, when I was reading, I was like, well, really, where are the red words in, you know, the red letters in the Bible about something like gun control? And so this, I felt, might have been the first chapter where it was a little forced by the author.
Tell more about that.
So I mean, I'll just put out there my personal belief. I think that if the founding fathers were teleported now to 2020 and looked at all of the parts of the Constitution and how they were interpreted and, you know, the knock-on effects of everything, I think they would be physically ill at the way that the Second Amendment is interpreted and treated in America now. And if I had a magic wand and was president for a day or whatever, I'd wave it and make it go away myself. But back to your question of, I thought that he was taking a very hot button issue. And I mean, he's done with all the other, I mean, this is not the first hot button issue. It's chapter 8 or something, right? But we definitely ought to take this on with politicians as humans, not even as red letter Christians. But I just didn't see any of the red letter words that were necessarily applicable. I mean, he talks, I think, in there about the dagger, but, you know, the dagger is to fulfill Old Testament prophecy. You know, go get some daggers so that they'll be, you know, so his band will be numbered against the criminals. So there he says, if you have a weapon, you're a criminal, right? I mean, but I just felt this one was a little bit of a stretch for me.
Yeah, I don't know, John. What do other people think? I have my thoughts on that, and I'm not going to weigh in until I hear from others.
I'll speak my little bit. I have 2 sons and a grandson who just turned 29, and they all are CHD holders, and they're hunters, and they're very careful with their guns and have locked cabinets. And I feel like they do the right thing. My son, who is the most avid hunter, eats everything he kills. Even if it's some wild hog, he finds a way to eat it. And so, you know, looking from his point of view and the fact that it's been in my family since he probably got his first gun when he was 13, which means his dad and I bought it for him. They've grown up with them and they've been respectful of them. And I don't think it'll ever change. In fact, he has written up a gun legacy to pass those guns that he owns onto his son. So I have a feeling I'm on the other side of Campolo if we had a left and right divide line. And that's okay. I mean, this is old stuff to me. And sometimes I get angry at him reading it because I just feel like he's one-sided, which I guess if I wrote my book, I'd be one-sided.
Yeah, I don't know, Rita. I really don't know. I think he is a gun owner. So I'm not sure that that's as much his issue as, and I don't think, you know, my perspective of him and listening to him in other areas. Yeah, I don't think that that's his issue. Gun ownership isn't his concern, because I do believe he, for one, I think he owns a gun, and two, I think I've been with him, so I've seen security around him of persons carrying, you know, for his protection. I think more for his thought is well, my guess is, let me just say it's a guess, is the idolatry, right? The biblical idolatry of guns and the elevation of guns as a golden calf. So I don't think that he would be dismissive of hunters and responsible gun ownership. I mean, I remember, was it 5 years ago, 80% of NRA members wanted more gun control. And, you know, what the nation wanted, what NRA members wanted, was rapidly on the other swing of where politics was. And I found that, I think that is truth telling in some way. Julie?
I think everybody's had some really great points. The one that I wanted to speak on, and that is what John mentioned. I thought that this was forced also.
Yeah.
To a point. And then I began to think about it. Well, how exactly? Trying to use what Campolo wants us to do. Trying to use what we think about things. And so the I like to use the word bunny path that I went down was that it's not inherent in my mind that, and I think Campolo made this point, that everything in the Bible Jesus did not speak of. Guns were not invented, was not spoken on, but he did, and you know, through the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill. Now, so when you look at that perspective, acknowledging that Jesus did refer to all of that and apply it to what we're thinking, then how do we address that as red letter Christians? And that is, in my mind, that we tighten up our systems to address the murders and everything that's happened. Now, given that, and his point was that the American culture is known for being an extremely violent society, the problems get into is self-protection is a key one. That's what's driven a lot of the ideology, and it's for different reasons. Some people say protection for the government, some from protection from crime. So there's different thoughts about why we should be able to have weapons. But the problem with it is this has been completely abused. The whole thing has been completely abused. Guns have fallen into the hands of the wrong people. And so therefore our systems at controlling the issue are not working. And then when you look at a root cause analysis, well, why exactly is that? And I think there's a lot of answers associated with that. One is because we as a society, we as a culture here in the United States, we like guns, and we like the idea of the power that it gives each individual. And therefore, that is the root of that particular addiction. Now, one of the other aspects that concerns me is this is also a political alignment issue. So, for example, when you begin to look at, let's say, the evangelical left, who are big gun rights owners, they believe that they're protecting themselves from everybody else. And so I guess where, in summary, as I began to look at this, what I think we're standing, in my mind, as a red letter Christian, I do not wish to take away someone's right to own a weapon to protect themselves. I do think there's a right way and a wrong way, and it must be controlled to prevent murder. It must be controlled to present it, to allow it to fall in the hands of children. Some of these things have been enacted, but the enforcement issue is it's just terrible. Anyway, that's kind of where I'm at. I do think we need to have more control. We have to keep it out of the hands of people who should not have weapons. There needs to be mandatory training required throughout the United States that not only evaluates the people who seek to have weapons, but also how to handle weapons. And that is inconsistent everywhere. If you cannot have that, then you cannot have a permit to operate a weapon. I didn't say, that they have to be registered or anything. I'm just saying that people have to learn how to handle something. Heck, you have to learn how to have a license to operate a motor vehicle, one of the deadliest things that there is in our society. But no, don't need that to have a gun.
Thank you, Julie. John or Hillary?
I'm with Julie 100% on this. I mean, it's not an issue. I'm not against gun ownership. I'm for more gun control and regulation of it. I mean, all guns are not the same, right? Just like we regulate everything in this country. Automobiles, there's standards for what automobiles are street legal and which belong on a race course or on a drag strip, and who can drive them, and how big. You can have a commercial driver's license, which authorizes you to drive an 18-wheeler, but I couldn't go out there and buy one and drive it down the road myself. And Julie, I know you know exactly what I'm going to say. There's no reason that any citizen in the United States needs to have a 50 cal machine gun that was designed to be put on the commander's turret of an M1A1 Abrams tank. There's no reason that needs to be in anybody's private possession, none whatsoever. And that's, we have lost our minds on some of this. It's too bad.
So let's, and we're not going to get to the next chapter today. And I want to ask one more question before we move to wrapping up. And that is, let's, it's easy. It really is easy to talk about this issue from a political lens. And I think the important part, even if we felt like maybe it felt a little forced, the question still holds: how should red letter Christians engage this issue? And I want to come back to your point, John, about the red letters the red letters don't seemingly talk about guns, because that's anachronistic. But Campolo elevates two occasions about arms, and one is before he commissions the disciples to go out and to put an arm upon me, to wear a sword. And the other one was the occasion upon his arrest, where the disciples take arms, and Jesus says, those who live by the sword perish by the sword. And my Christian takeaway from that is, and I'm not sure if I remember saying this last week or in some other context, but Jesus was never a doormat. Jesus wasn't the pacifist in the sense that, I think I did say this last week, in the sense that just let me lie down and but that there is something about the idea of having the means to protect oneself, and yet when he says those who live by it die by it or perish by it, there's two parts that he means by that. One is those who live by it, meaning those who elevate it as the quick answer to everything, or those who turn it into an idol, will die or perish by it. And he's not necessarily referring to physical death, but also spiritual death. You know, in the few times that I have been armed or had the power of an arm in my hand, I can realize and feel I now have all I need to end the life of something else. And that is a profound responsibility and burden. And there are those who certainly, maybe like Rita's children, who have so much more courage than I do to hunt. I don't have that courage to hunt. I don't have the stomach to end the life of something else, especially something that we will give grace for and eat and be fed from, and therefore as a means of hunting, you know, I have no condemnation of that for myself, and nor would I think that Jesus would, as one who, in a society who used tools to hunt and tools to prepare food. I get that. The idea, though, is having that power in one's hand and just how easy it is to end the life of someone else is what begins to erode away at the soul and the soul of a person, and how careless one can be with that responsibility, even with the safest of intentions. You know, you guys know that just in the 2 years that I've been here, we had a man die by suicide by a cop in the courtyard of the church, who got upset with someone at the bar behind us and grabbed his sawed-off shotgun and his AR-15 and started firing in the air to scare people off from the bar. The police came, they chased him into our courtyard. He barricaded himself and he decided that this is how he wanted to take himself out. So he charged them, guns blazing in the air so that they would shoot him. They shot him and killed him on the porch of our church. That was haunting. Just at the beginning of November, on that person, having spoken with this family multiple times afterwards, part of the grief they were going through was just how strong and rabid he was about gun control because he had kids in the house. At the beginning of November, we had a murder here in the neighborhood by a man who murdered his wife with kids in the house, who everyone knows that he was absolutely not only a hunter, but absolutely super secure with his guns and the access to them. And yet, in both cases, in the heat of a moment, something within them empowered them or fueled them to say that the way to resolve this is to go grab this thing, this weapon, which I think that is just, I think for me, that is what, for some, begins, what Jesus is talking about, begins to erode away. And that's not every gun owner. Certainly not every gun owner. That's not a condemnation on gun owners at all. But maybe those who elevate it as an idol. And I think that might be what he's referring to there. I'm going on a trip this summer. I've told my brothers both about it, that I'm going to be driving along the border from Texas from Brownsville all the way to San Diego. And both of them have been hounding me for a month for me to get a gun and to drive the border with a gun in my car. And they're both pretty displeased that I, A, don't have a gun, and B, wouldn't want a gun in my car. But then at the same time, I'm also trying to respect what they want from me, which is to be safe and to find a way for me to be safe while I'm out on my adventure. And I respect that. And I feel there's a Jesus moment of that, as Jesus is saying to his disciples, wear a sword upon you as you go out onto this dangerous land on this dangerous mission. And so those are some things that are running through my head about how red letter Christians might engage in this issue. Let me turn over to you now, thinking through the lens of our faith, and how might we as Christians elevate our faith in engaging a topic such as gun control?
Yeah, I don't have to go that deep and look too much beyond the red letters, beyond the ones that say, love your neighbor as yourself. And if you interpret it that way and you look and see what the proliferation of firearms is doing to the health and safety of a lot of people in the country, it's we're not trying to take everybody's guns away from everybody, but regulate to the degree you can and collect up the ones that are in the wrong hands in the way you can, and just make it a safer place. That's it.
Rita?
I think part of the problem, and it's not the whole thing, but we still have a me generation that thinks that they are superior to someone else. And when they get in a tight situation, they're going to do what they can to come out on top. And unfortunately, if you've got a gun in the hand, that's where they go.
Or behind the wheel of a car in road rage and anything that,
Yes.
that levels the playing field, so to speak. But besides, mind against mind or body against body.
Right.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if it's generational as much as it's just a cultural sickness, because I think it's of any age. I don't know that it's age specific or generation specific, as much as it just may be, in essence, a part of the culture in which we live. Julie says, I think, as Campolo says, we must vote for our representatives that have a balanced perspective. Yeah, and of course he says that in the introduction, right, that red letter Christians don't straight line party vote. They're taking each candidate and finding which candidate best aligns, maybe not in lockstep, but best aligns with those red letters. And I think that's the homework that we have to do as we're preparing to vote, and or hold our elected officials, even the ones we didn't vote for, accountable for what they're putting forward. Thank you for all that, everybody. I appreciate your candor and the grace with which you're approaching these topics. I think I'm not entirely sure that I'm going to return to chapter 9 next week. And so originally on the docket, it's 10, 11, and 12. And so why don't we just pick up with chapter 10? Of course, it's important. My wife is an educator. I've got a lot of, emotions related to education, but I don't want us to get too far off a schedule. So let's pick up with chapter 10, 11, and 12 for next week, which these don't get any easier at all. Chapter 10, abortion. Oh, these don't get any easier. Might I have someone close our time in prayer? And as I have, there are 4 prayers available from which you are welcome to choose, or you may offer one yourself. Rita?
I think this is one that hasn't been used. Grant, O Lord Jesus, that the ears which have heard the voice of your songs may be closed to the voice of dispute, that the eyes which have seen your great love may also behold your blessed hope, that the tongues which have sung your praise may speak the truth in love, that the feet which have walked in your courts may walk in the region of light, and that the bodies which have received your living body may be restored in newness of life. Glory to you for your inexpressible gift. Amen.
Amen. God's